Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have come together to form the Alliance of Sahel States. Each is ruled by a military junta, and that's led to a split from the larger West African regional bloc, ECOWAS.
The Sahel, a land of scorching days and restless nights, has long been a chessboard for global powers. From French military bases to Western aid packages with strings attached, the region has always felt the weight of foreign hands. But now, something is shifting. In the vast stretch of land where sand meets ambition, one man's voice is standing out clearly in all the noise. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is leading a movement in the Sahel region against the West. This is not a story of rebellion, but a region reclaiming its voice, its resources, and its destiny. Before we continue, hit that like button to help us beat the YouTube algorithm. While the world watches Ukraine and Gaza, something never seen before is happening in the heart of Africa. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has quietly orchestrated what many are calling the most significant anti-Western alliance Africa has seen since independence. The Sahel, which includes Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and beyond, has been going through a lot in recent years. Here, communities battle with droughts, insurgencies, and the ghosts of deals made far away in air-conditioned rooms. Every year, the people of this region watch their wealth, gold, uranium, livestock flow outward while their schools crumbled and their wells ran dry. Western powers had been players in the Sahel, not as saviors but as architects of an unbalanced game. France, with its colonial shadow still lingering, maintained a heavy presence through military operations like Barkhane. Billions were spent, bases were built, and drones buzzed overhead. Yet, for many in the Sahel, security did not improve, it worsened. By 2020, jihadist attacks had spiked by 40% in Burkina Faso and Mali, compared to 5 years earlier. Locals began to ask, who are these missions protecting? The answer mostly pointed back to foreign interests: uranium mines in Niger feeding French nuclear plants, gold concessions in Mali lining corporate pockets. The Sahel was bleeding, and the bandages offered came with terms and conditions. The people were tired. Between 2020 and 2022, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger saw their governments toppled by military leaders fed up with the situation. These looked like power grabs, but they were eruptions of frustration. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, then a 34-year-old captain, stepped into the chaos after 2 coups in 2022. He got to work immediately. He did not promise miracles. He spoke of dignity, of a region that could stand on its own. He knew that the West's playbook of aid, troops, and trade deals was not working for them. It was working for someone else, and something needed to change. It was not just the violence or the poverty. It was the humiliation of dependency. Western aid mostly came with demands. Open your markets, privatize your resources, align with our policies. In Niger, for instance, French companies controlled much of the uranium trade, yet 80% of the population lived without reliable electricity. In Mali, gold exports soared, but schools in rural areas had no books. It was clear that the Sahel's wealth was fueling global economies, while its people managed to survive each day. Traoré and his counterparts in Mali and Niger saw this not as misfortune but as a design they could dismantle. They had gotten to a breakpoint. This breaking point birthed the Alliance of Sahel States in 2023. It consisted of the 3 countries in the Sahel region of West Africa. Traoré and his allies signed the Liptako-Gourma Charter, named for the border region where their nations meet, creating the AES to protect their independence. It was not a sudden spark, but a flame kindled by shared struggles against external threats and Western dominance. Traoré's voice, fierce and clear, rallied the Sahel to reject ECOWAS, seen as being submissive to foreign powers, and embrace a new path. By 2025, the AES had become a symbol of unity, with Traoré at its forefront, inspiring crowds in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou to believe in a Sahel that answers to itself. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger wanted to rewrite the rules. They expelled French forces, tore up old agreements, and started talking about a shared future. Traoré framed it as a return to true independence, a chance to protect their borders and their resources. But as much as it looked like just saying no to the West, it was more about saying yes to something else. A Sahel that could trade its gold for schools, its uranium for hospitals, its future for itself. There were risks involved in doing these, Traoré knew. Turning away from the West meant losing aid, facing sanctions, and navigating a world where new allies like Russia had their own agendas. But for Traoré, the bigger risk was staying the course and watching the Sahel remain a pawn, while its people paid the price. The Sahel's breaking point was not a moment. The region was ready to bet on itself, and Traoré was the one leading the charge. The Alliance of Sahel States is not just another regional organization, but a declaration of war against centuries of foreign control. It represents something unexpected in modern African politics. What started as isolated military coups evolved into coordinated resistance that is reshaping geopolitical calculations from Paris to Washington. Traoré stands at the center of this transformation, orchestrating moves that have caught global powers completely off guard. His strategy combines military pragmatism with economic nationalism and information warfare tactics that rival anything produced by major powers. Traoré's genius lies in recognizing that individual African countries remain vulnerable to foreign pressure, but coordinated resistance can succeed where isolated efforts fail. Mali had already expelled French forces and invited Russian Wagner mercenaries, but faced intense diplomatic and economic pressure. Niger's military seized power in July 2023, but confronted threats of invasion from neighboring countries. The Alliance of Sahel States transformed these individual rebellions into coordinated resistance. The Mutual Defense Pact means any attack on one member triggers responses from all three. Economic cooperation agreements ensure that sanctions targeting individual countries can be circumvented through regional trade. Joint military command structures coordinate anti-insurgency operations across borders that previously fragmented security efforts. This coordination has already proven decisive. When ECOWAS threatened to invade Niger following the July 2023 coup, Mali and Burkina Faso immediately pledged military support for their new ally. The prospect of fighting three countries simultaneously, rather than just Niger, made intervention very expensive and risky. Nigeria, ECOWAS's dominant member, ultimately refused to lead an invasion that could destabilize the entire region. This united front sent a powerful message that these countries were no longer acting alone. They were thinking and moving together. That same spirit of cooperation shaped how the alliance was built. The alliance's structure reflects Traoré's strategic thinking. Rather than creating hierarchical relationships where stronger members dominate weaker ones, the Confederation operates on principles of equality and mutual benefit. Each country contributes according to its capabilities. Mali provides agricultural products and experienced fighters. Niger supplies uranium and strategic location. Burkina Faso offers gold reserves and organizational leadership. It was a joint institution that facilitates coordination without imposing external control. The Alliance Parliament meets regularly to coordinate policies. Military commanders share intelligence and plan joint operations. Economic ministers negotiate trade agreements and infrastructure projects. Cultural exchanges promote shared identity that goes beyond colonial borders. Traoré's economic strategy targets the fundamental mechanisms through which Western powers have extracted African wealth. Colonial-era mining contracts typically granted foreign companies exclusive access to valuable deposits in exchange for minimal royalties and token employment of local workers. Agricultural exports were processed in European factories that captured most value-added benefits. Financial systems channeled African savings through Western banks that invested them in wealthy countries rather than local development. However, the alliance is systematically reversing these arrangements. Mining contracts signed under previous governments are being renegotiated or canceled outright. Foreign companies that refuse new terms lose their operating licenses. Resource extraction increasingly involves joint ventures where African partners hold majority stakes and management control. Burkina Faso's gold sector exemplifies this transformation. Under previous governments, international mining companies extracted gold worth billions of dollars annually while paying minimal taxes and employing few local workers. Traoré's government has nationalized several major mines and renegotiated contracts for others. Gold production now generates substantially more revenue for the state budget and funds development projects in mining communities. Similar changes are occurring across the alliance of Sahel countries. Niger has restricted uranium exports to France while exploring partnerships with Russia, China, and other buyers willing to pay higher prices. Mali has renegotiated mining contracts to ensure local processing of raw materials before export. Agricultural cooperatives receive government support to develop value-added products rather than simply exporting raw crops. The alliance is also creating alternative financial systems that reduce dependence on Western-controlled institutions. Plans for a common currency would replace the CFA franc, which has kept 14 African countries tied to French monetary policy since independence. Regional development banks are being established to fund infrastructure projects without conditions imposed by International Monetary Fund or World Bank lending. These cross-border infrastructure projects demonstrate the alliance's commitment to economic integration. But apart from the economic aspect, Traoré also has an approach to security that represents a complete departure from Western models that dominated the Sahel since the 2010s. French, American, and European forces operated from heavily fortified bases, relied on expensive technology, and maintained limited contact with local populations. Their missions focused on eliminating high-value targets rather than controlling territory or building lasting security. These strategies produced tactical successes but strategic failures. Drone strikes and special operations raids killed insurgent leaders, but new commanders quickly emerged to replace them. Foreign forces could clear areas temporarily, but insurgents returned once international troops moved elsewhere. Local populations sometimes viewed foreign soldiers as occupiers rather than protectors, limiting intelligence cooperation and popular support. Now, the alliance military strategy emphasizes territorial control, population engagement, and sustainable security mechanisms. Joint operations involve extensive coordination between military forces and civilian authorities. Cleared areas are immediately occupied by local administration and security forces. Development projects begin as soon as territory is secured, demonstrating immediate benefits of government control. Russian Wagner mercenaries provide crucial support, but the alliance strategy is not dependent on continued foreign assistance. Wagner fighters train local forces, share tactical knowledge, and participate in major operations. However, the goal is building indigenous capacity that can operate independently once initial threats are eliminated. The results have exceeded expectations. Areas of Mali that French forces never fully controlled have been cleared and held by alliance operations. Burkina Faso's military has pushed insurgents from territories they occupied for years. Niger has launched aggressive campaigns against networks that previously operated with relative impunity. Although the alliance is cooperating with Russia, another foreign power, it is a carefully calculated strategy rather than simple alignment with Moscow's global interests. Russian involvement provides crucial military support and alternative economic partnerships, but alliance leaders maintain autonomy in ways that distinguish their relationships from previous colonial dependencies. Wagner mercenaries offer combat effectiveness that enabled alliance military victories, but their role is clearly temporary. Russian advisors train local forces with the understanding that foreign assistance will eventually be phased out. Russian companies invest in alliance economies, but compete with Chinese and other alternatives rather than enjoying monopolistic positions. The key difference is conditionality. Western partnerships typically require political and economic reforms as conditions for cooperation. International Monetary Fund loans demand structural adjustment programs. World Bank development aid requires governance improvements. European investment involves environmental and labor standards. American military assistance includes human rights monitoring. Russian cooperation avoids these conditions. Moscow provides military support without demanding democratic reforms. Russian companies invest without requiring specific economic policies. Wagner mercenaries operate without imposing political oversight. This gives alliance governments greater autonomy to pursue their own domestic and regional agendas. The alliance populations view Russian involvement positively because it delivers concrete benefits without obvious costs. Russian mercenaries help defeat insurgents that terrorized communities for years. Russian mining investments create jobs and generate government revenue. Russian agricultural purchases provide markets for local producers. Many people argue that Russian support creates new dependencies that could be exploited later. Wagner mercenaries might become occupying forces. Russian companies could demand unfavorable contract revisions. Moscow might pressure alliance governments to support Russian positions in international forums. But alliance leaders appear conscious of these risks and are taking steps to reduce them. Military cooperation includes training programs designed to reduce dependence on foreign fighters. Economic partnerships involve multiple countries rather than exclusive relationships with Russia. Diplomatic positions maintain independence, even when generally aligned with Russian interests. As a result of this, Western powers are struggling to develop effective responses to alliance challenges because traditional tools of influence have proven inadequate or counterproductive. Military intervention is politically impossible after failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Economic sanctions have limited impact on countries that have already separated themselves from global markets. Diplomatic pressure lacks credibility when Western policies contributed to problems alliance governments claim to be solving. France has been forced to fundamentally reconsider its African relationships. Military bases that provided leverage for decades have been shut down. Economic agreements that guaranteed favorable resource access have been terminated. Political networks that ensured friendly governments have collapsed. French officials acknowledge privately that their traditional Africa policy is no longer sustainable. The United States also faces similar strategic challenges. Military bases that provided access to the Sahel have been lost. Counter-terrorism partnerships that shared intelligence and coordinated operations have ended. Development programs that influenced government policies have been rejected. American policymakers are debating whether to accept reduced influence or attempt more aggressive responses that could backfire. European Union institutions have begun developing new approaches that emphasize partnership rather than dominance. Their trade agreements now offer more favorable terms for African exports. Even their development aid focuses on infrastructure and industrialization rather than governance reforms. These changes represent significant shifts from previous policies, but may be insufficient to regain lost influence. Some Western officials argue for accommodation strategies that accept alliance autonomy while maintaining beneficial relationships. This approach would focus on economic cooperation, counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, and multilateral diplomacy rather than attempts to restore previous levels of control. Some of them are agreeing that partial influence is preferable to complete exclusion from strategically important regions. However, institutional momentum and domestic political pressures make fundamental policy changes difficult. French politicians cannot easily explain why their country should accept reduced African influence. American strategic planners struggle with losing military access in regions they consider vital to national security. Many European business interests are still resisting the acceptance of less favorable investment conditions. But in spite of all these, Traoré's success is inspiring similar movements across Africa, creating a continental shift toward true independence that challenges Western influence everywhere. Opposition politicians in Senegal question their country's continued hosting of French military bases. Student movements in Ghana are demanding renegotiation of mining contracts that favor foreign companies. Many civil society organizations are studying the alliance policies as potential models for their own countries. African leaders who previously assumed they needed Western approval to govern successfully now see alternatives. Populations who accepted foreign dominance as inevitable now believe resistance is possible. International observers who dismissed African capacity for self-governance must reconsider their assumptions. Chad provides the most dramatic example of alliance influence. When protests erupted against French-backed President Mahamat Déby recently, demonstrators clearly referenced the alliance as an inspiration. Although Déby retained power, his government was forced to renegotiate agreements with France and promise greater resource revenue sharing with local populations. Similar dynamics are emerging across West Africa. Ivory Coast's opposition has demanded reduction of French military presence and renegotiation of economic agreements. Ghana's parliament has debated proposals to review mining contracts that critics argue favor foreign companies. Even Nigeria, ECOWAS's dominant member, faces internal pressure to reduce dependence on Western security partnerships. East African countries are also taking notice. Tanzania has begun questioning World Bank conditions attached to development loans. Kenya's government faces pressure to review military cooperation agreements with the United States. South Africa's ruling party includes factions that explicitly praise the alliance model and call for similar policies. The alliance represents more than African regional politics. It exemplifies global trends toward multipolarity that challenge Western dominance across multiple continents. Countries worldwide are questioning American supremacy and Western-dominated international institutions. The alliance success encourages similar resistance movements while demonstrating that alternatives to Western leadership can succeed. Two countries that have benefited from countries seeking alternatives to Western influence are China and Russia. The alliance countries have increasingly turned to Chinese companies for infrastructure development, technology transfer, and manufactured goods. Chinese development models offer examples of rapid growth without democratic governance. Russia has also gained strategic allies and access to critical resources through the alliance partnerships. African uranium, gold, and agricultural products provide alternatives to Western markets. Their military cooperation with the Sahel states enhances Russian influence in regions previously dominated by Western powers. Other non-Western powers are also seeing opportunities in working with the alliance of Sahel states. India's companies are exploring investments in alliance countries. Turkey is developing trade relationships and providing development assistance. Iran and North Korea have established diplomatic contacts. Brazil and other emerging economies are studying alliance policies as potential models for reducing Western influence. The overall effect is creating a more competitive international system where Western powers must negotiate rather than dictate terms of global cooperation. The alliance of Sahel states' success demonstrates that unified resistance to Western pressure can succeed, encouraging similar efforts elsewhere. How the West continues to respond to the challenges the alliance poses will influence how other countries calculate their own relationships with Western powers. Successful accommodation might preserve some Western influence while accepting reduced dominance. Aggressive reactions that fail to achieve objectives could accelerate shifts toward alternative partnerships and institutions. Regardless of whether the alliance of Sahel states ultimately succeeds, Traoré has already achieved something historically significant by demonstrating that coordinated African resistance to Western dominance is possible and can deliver concrete benefits to local populations. The Sahel is no longer a land waiting for others to shape its fate. Under Ibrahim Traoré's bold leadership, the alliance of Sahel states has become a beacon of hope, uniting Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in a shared quest for freedom from Western dominance. Traoré's vision has turned the Sahel into a force that the world cannot ignore, a region that writes its own story with courage and unity. Traoré, alongside Mali's Assimi Goïta and Niger's Abdourahmane Chiani, has woven a bond that transforms challenges into opportunities. Together, they have built a Sahel that thrives on its own strengths. Whether future historians judge Traoré as a successful liberation leader or a failed authoritarian will depend on his ability to deliver sustained improvements in security, prosperity, and dignity for the populations he claims to represent. But his impact on African politics and global power dynamics has already been profound and irreversible. The young revolutionary captain has fundamentally altered the landscape of international relations. His alliance challenges centuries of Western dominance over Africa, while inspiring similar resistance movements worldwide. The Sahel story is no longer written by outsiders. It is crafted by its own hands, with Ibrahim Traoré leading the charge. This journey is just beginning, and it is one worth watching. What do you think of Traoré's vision? Can the Sahel redefine its place in the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about this new dawn. If this story inspired you, hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more tales of a changing world. The Sahel is rising. Stay with us to see where it goes next.